rightly said that there are populist leaders that put an emphasis on sovereignty and the will of the people, and sort of like using that emphasis, they frame international organizations or international agreements as constraints to national autonomy or to national will. And they are, of course, absolutely correct, because that is the whole point of international law. The whole point of international law is to constrain sovereignty of states. But of course, there are certain things that we need to note on this. The first thing to note is that that constraint on sovereignty can be either good or bad, depending on where you're coming from, right? So to be very simplistic, certain rules may constrain state power to impose a particular tax regime, or they may constrain state power to introduce certain policies which the government feels is for the benefit of the population, or they may constrain state power to introduce particular economic policies, right, for the benefit of the many. Other rules, on the other hand, may serve to constrain state power to violate human rights, or they may serve to constrain state action to commit atrocities, such as genocide, right, or to use force. The point that I'm trying to make with this is that neither populism nor the rules of international law are in any way neutral. They do come with a particular charge. They do come with a particular political, economic inflection. What I mean by saying that populism is not neutral, we can't, the term itself is one of those sort of, I like to call them weasel words, like they do on Wikipedia. We use the term and everybody says, oh, populism, and then people are going to be like, oh, that sounds bad. And so everybody should be against it. But of course, there can be perfectly good populism, because the way that the term is used, without any specific definition, other than, oh, support for the will of the people, isn't actually helpful at all. Because, for example, in certain areas, they will tell you that it is populist to say that education should be free. Or they say it would be populist to argue that there should be free public transportation. Or it is populist that the rents should be frozen because the cost of living is unaffordable. Or they would say it would be populist, you know, whatever other examples that you can think of. At the same time, it is also populist, or they would say it's also populist, to argue that all refugees and immigrants should be expelled because they're taking our jobs. That's also populist. But you see, or that withdrawal from the WHO is a good thing, right? Or that we should withdraw from climate agreements because that will put strain on the standards of living. So, but these things are all completely different, right? And they can have a completely different charge. So just to label everything as populist, for me, is either lazy or it is actually suspect, right? Something's hiding behind that. Now, with respect to the erosion of international law and the international legal order, that's my second point. International law doesn't actually come from the heavens. It is actually made, like all law, you'll be surprised to find out, is actually something that doesn't exist in nature. We make it. Now, who's we? When it comes to international law, it is states that make international law. They make it through practice, and in particular, they make it through contestation. Like all law, this is a matter of political contestation. What becomes a rule of international law is a matter of a political fight between states. And as usually happens, mostly international law reflects the interests of, yes, you guessed it, the powerful, the former colonial powers, the ones that have been wielding the power in this world. They are the ones whose interests are primarily reflected in most rules of international law. Now, don't be shocked, it's the same in domestic law. It's not the interests of the people that are reflected mostly in domestic law. It's usually the interests of those who made it to political power. That doesn't mean, of course, that the law is not also catering, at least to some extent, for the interests of the less powerful. But that has happened through contestation, through the fact that certain of the less powerful actors have fought for and have gained concessions which are reflected in law, right? So here what we have is the outcome of a fight where the rules of international law in and of themselves sort of reflect that kind of contestation. Some of them are in the interest of the powerful, and some of them are concessions to the less powerful, limitations on the power of the powerful, and so on and so forth. Like you mentioned the UN Charter, 1945. Of course, the UN Charter does contain some concessions, right? Prohibition of the use of force, prohibition of intervention, and what have you. But at the same time, it comes with a very high price. It comes with a very high price of 5 permanent members of the Security Council wielding a veto. It comes with a very high price of the Bretton Woods institutions, which I'm sure you are familiar with, right? IMF and World Bank, they impose conditionalities on all sorts of things, and so on and so forth. These are part of the price in that sense. So in short, not all of international law is good or bad. There are particular rules that are good, depending on which side of the fence you're on, and particular rules that can be seen as bad. But more importantly than that, international law is not written in stone. Just like it doesn't come from above, it is not written in stone. So when we're talking about erosion, what exactly are we talking about? We are talking about, in reality, you say erosion, everybody fears erosion. If you hear erosion, you'll be like, oh my God, this is horrific. But in reality, what we're talking about is the constant contestation over rules of international law that happen all the time. And of course, if there is no resistance to particular pressures in the development of certain rules, these rules will develop in the direction that they are pushed. And who is pushing them? It will usually be the more powerful states that are pushing for a particular wide interpretation, development of the rules. Let me give you like just a couple of examples very, very quickly, and then I will shut up, I promise. But use of force is prohibited in international relations, isn't it? Well, I'm pretty sure you're very aware that use of force does happen. Especially in this audience, it should be familiar to most. Now, of course, here's the problem. Use of force is only supposed to be allowed in response to an armed attack as self-defense. But if for decades we accept powerful states widening the definition of self-defense, talking about self-defense against non-state actors in the territory of a third state without that state's permission, having drones fly all over the territory and target particular individuals because they say, oh, this person has, the beard is too long, so they look kind of like Osama, so let's bomb him. I have issues with that. I have a beard, my beard is more of a political beard, but it still means that I am targeted at airports, where I'm usually picked out of the line and asked to undergo a random check. And I'm like, yes, I'm sure it's random. It looks very random. But it's not just that, right? Pushes for preventive self-defense. Like, for example, oh, Iran might, in I don't know how many months, years, whatever, develop a nuclear weapon, let's bomb them now. These things are not actually the prevailing interpretation of the prohibition of the use of force. But if they are pushed, and they are constantly pushed, and states don't react to them, they will become the law, because this is how international law is made. If you want another example, let's just take another random example, completely sort of like thought out, not real at all. If you don't react to genocide and war crimes, the prohibitions on genocide and war crimes will weaken. If these things happen and states do not react because of their particular interests, then nobody reacts, then this weakens the prohibition. This is not erosion. I mean, it is erosion in one sense, but this is how international law is made. And if you think that this is peculiar to international law, you would be wrong, because this is exactly the same way that domestic law is made. And in fact, I can give you examples from both the countries that I'm connected to, be it the United Kingdom or Greece, because, of course, as you can tell by my name, I'm not part of the United Kingdom sort of like high classes. but I can give you examples in both these situations where long-standing legal rights have been eroded, have been weakened because of legislative action. It's very simple. Just a few weeks ago in Greece, they passed a law that basically does away with the 8-hour workday, something that has been a legal right for almost a century. And they allowed employers to require 13-hour workdays from the workers. This is shocking, but this is how the law develops. If the people don't react to this, the right goes away. Because rights are not written in stone. Rights are concessions in law, but the fact that they're in law doesn't mean that the law can change. Do you want another example? In the United Kingdom, they have now proscribed Palestine Action, an NGO, as a terrorist organization, which means that there are grandmas and grandpas who go to protests holding little placards that say, "I support Palestine Action," and they are imprisoned. They are imprisoned, and this is for the right to protest. In the United Kingdom, the enlightened West, not to mention passing laws that qualify Rwanda as a safe third country, be what may, taking it away from the courts so that we can send refugees to Rwanda. So this is what happens if you don't actually fight for the rights. Now, you heard yesterday, in a talk that I enjoyed very much, Dr. Samshad Akhtar, from the former governor of the State Bank, she said that the international trade rules are currently being rewritten. She is, of course, right. But it's more than that. It's more than trade rules. All of international rules are currently being rewritten. In fact, all legal rules are constantly being rewritten. Unless we are vigilant, they will not be rewritten in our interest. And so here is the question. The question is, do you think that the powerful grant legal rights and legal concessions as charity? The answer is no. The powerful only grant legal rights and legal concessions in response to pressure. And so if we are worried about the erosion of certain international legal rules, then what we need to do, both as states, but also as civil society within our states, is to exert the pressure that is required so that our states stand in defense of those legal rules that we feel need to be defended. So I'll leave it at that for now before I enrage you further, and we can come back with more specific examples for anyone who has the time.